So if we think about the ones who revolt, so there's large-scale rebellions, people saying, this is not the state I want to live in. We are the people, who are from this region, and we want to define our political future. The category of people who stay in terms of whether they want to leave. Some do. We have a lot of examples, especially from 1912, 1913, of very poor Muslim communities who would prefer to leave and have very limited resources to do so. And then there's others who decide they're going to stay. We're going to build whatever's next. We're going to stay in our homes. These are our lands, and we're going to figure out a way to try to make this work.
The Ottoman Empire controlled much of the Middle East and North Africa from the 14th to the early 20th century. Southeast and Central Europe were also part of Ottoman territory. And as the empire collapsed, Ottoman Muslims became citizens of new European states. Professor Emily Greble, chair of the Department of History at Vanderbilt University, tells us the stories of several generations of local Muslims living in Ottoman Europe, showing how Muslims helped shape Europe's new nation-states and reminding us that Muslim histories are European histories.
I think that's a great framing of it, a watered-down version of Christianity, because secularism, I think, becomes a kind of ideology that seeks to impose a single norm on all, heterogeneous populations of Europe. And what I try to kind of engage with in the book is how that's, there's deep contradictions embedded in the idea of secularism. And also, some of it just does not make logical sense.
Welcome to Muslim Footprints, a deep dive into Muslim civilizations through the ages, accompanied by some of the best experts in their field. This episode is called Muslims and the Making of Modern Europe. Hi, Emily.
Hello.
What role did Muslims play in the making of modern Europe?
Typically, when we talk about modern Europe, we're thinking about this era after the French Revolution that kind of goes up through the present. And there's certain kind of core concepts or ideas that sort of undergird what we mean by the modern European period. That includes concepts like citizenship, modern statehood, modernization, and modernity are sort of these big terms that get thrown around. But also sort of the evolution of sort of a secular Europe and kind of a new political project that moves away from sort of the structures of a religious-based pre-modern different European societies. And so part of what I try to think about is where do Muslims and local Muslim communities intersect with these stories and how their existence and presence shaped them as they evolved.
So basically, very specifically, the idea is that Muslims are not newcomers to Europe. So the title of your book, which is Muslims and the Making of Modern Europe, it's a fascinating premise. It's what brought Muslim Footprints to Nashville. How did you come up with this title?
Well, I think to first understand how I came up with the title, I would love to give you a little bit of background on sort of some of the driving goals of the book itself. The first is I wanted to write a history that really situated Muslims as Europeans. Often media and politicians frame Muslims in Europe as outsiders, as new arrivals, as immigrants, as asylum seekers, as colonial migrants. All of these concepts they other Muslims, and they juxtapose a European norm against Muslims. And that sort of it completely erases the many indigenous Muslim communities that have lived in Europe for centuries. And I wanted to really sort of highlight their story and bring it back into a kind of broader European narrative. So The region I focus on is Southeastern Europe, particularly the country or the regions that would become part of Yugoslavia. But there's other places where we have long histories of indigenous Muslim communities in Europe as well. Ukraine, Romania, Poland, Russia. And so what I wanted to do was sort of center these experiences. The second thing that was really important to me was to think about how does the European, or sort of our European historical narratives, how do they develop differently if we start with Muslim stories and Muslim voices and Muslim experiences? And so here, thinking a little bit about what is citizenship to Ottoman Muslims who are sort of handed a citizenship that they didn't necessarily want, and how do we understand and analyze citizenship? But also sort of, what is secularism and how can we understand what the European secular project is? And then kind of events. What does World War I look like for Europe's Muslims? What does World War II look like? What does, the communist project start to look like?
Why should we care about this story now?
Well, I think there is a certain urgency in our contemporary world to reminding sort of all of us, and especially policymakers, that there has been a long history of Muslims in Europe and that they are central to sort of the European idea and project. There has been a lot of sort of historical and political erasure of Muslim communities, and I'll give you an example of that. So when Russia attacked Ukraine, all across newspapers, there were sort of accounts that this was the first war crime and ethnic cleansing and violence in Europe since World War II, completely erasing and actively forgetting all of the violence. I mean, the forgetting it feels a little too weak of a verb, right? Actively erasing the violence and the genocide of Bosniaks, but also violence in Kosovo toward Kosovar Albanian Muslims. And I think it needs to be combated. And a way that we can do that is through unearthing and reminding, because there's many of these histories have been written, often in languages that smaller numbers of people speak or read, and reminding the international community that this is a central part of Europe and has been for a long time. And I think that, as Bosnia, especially Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, Albania, or the Republic of Kosovo, as they are sort of situating themselves on the larger European stage, it's vital that they are sort of included and talked to like other European nations.
Okay, so let's get into the start. So your book takes as its starting point the shattering of the Ottoman world and the displacement of Muslim communities across different states that captured Ottoman lands or succeeded from them. So the geography that we're talking about, is that the Balkans?
Yes. So the geography is the Balkans, also often referred to as Southeastern Europe, which is a term I like because it reminds us that this is very much part of Europe. And the countries that it would include today, these countries have had different boundaries and different names, but would include Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro, the Republic of North Macedonia, Kosovo, Serbia, and then also Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and Albania.
It's parts of the Ottoman Empire that become nation states in 1878. Mm-hmm. So can you talk us through this? Tell us what the Ottoman Empire was, what Europe was, mm-hmm. And how that changed as Europe absorbed parts of the Ottoman Empire. So just sort of that kind of broad history.
Sure. So we have two major redrawings of these political boundaries. The first is in 1878, and then the second is after the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913. So we have kind of two waves where things are really radically changing. In the first, a couple of things happen. The countries of Romania, Serbia and Montenegro become independent countries, and those are all countries that are formed within formerly Ottoman territory. And they had a kind of different political and legal relationship with the Ottomans in the mid-19th century. It's called legal autonomy. But for general purposes, thinking about them as that's their moment of sort of independence and statehood. And then also in 1878, Austria-Hungary occupies the province of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was also part of the Ottoman Empire. Then what happens after 1913, many of these countries, actually in 1908, Austria annexes Bosnia-Herzegovina. So they end the era of occupation and they formally annex the territory. Then after 1913, borders change again. And we have an expanded or enlarged Serbian state, Montenegrin state. I think at that point, the Greek state also is expanding. So what I try to deal with in the first part of the book is to really think about how all of these changes are happening from the perspective of the really diverse communities of Ottoman Muslims who are living across these broad areas. So for someone, for example, in a town like Novi Pazar, which is today a sort of medium-sized city in southern Serbia, with a Muslim majority. For someone in that town, what did it look like as these different borders were changing, as new states were coming in? Often these were very violent transitional moments. They came with expulsion and mass violence against Muslims. But there were also small communities that remained or migrated within the region, and also those who chose to stay, how they helped shape the political, economic, social, legal projects that emerged, right, with these new states.
Can we go back even a little bit further and kind of set the scene about the empires and the sort of what that empire situation looked like? So the Ottoman Empire, and what did you have in Europe? So this is before all this happened, and sort of the demise of the Ottoman Empire. So just that kind of history lesson.
Sure. So in this particular region, the big competing empires were the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, which then becomes known as Austria-Hungary. And then we also had the Prussian Empire. And those are kind of the four big European land empires that are sort of operating within what we would today maybe consider Central Europe or Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe. So the Ottomans were understood as a European empire. They were able to negotiate with other empires, and they were considered part of kind of the concert of Europe, which is this diplomatic framing. But over the course of the 19th century, other European powers slowly start to undermine Ottoman sovereignty. The Russian Empire wants to expand, and there's not really much place to go other than Ottoman lands. And the Habsburgs also are elevating and supporting Christian communities in the Ottoman Empire and arguing that Christians shouldn't be part of an Islamic empire. And then there's a real rhetoric that emerges that depicts the Ottomans as less civilized and less competent to manage and govern Europeans, right? And often European and Christian went hand in hand in their framing. And so they actively start to undermine and then support different Christian groups in sort of claiming land that used to belong to the Ottomans. So I use the phrase absorb. Sometimes I use conquer. I mean, there are military campaigns where, the Serbian army goes out and conquers Ottoman lands and claims them for their own.
So in the Ottoman Empire, it's definitely not just Muslims. There are big Christian, there are multi-denominational communities. in this empire?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's significant and widespread diverse Christian communities. There's Orthodox Christians, there's Armenian Christians. Within the Orthodox Christian communities, especially in the late 19th century, you have distinctions that emerge. There's the Greek Orthodox, the Bulgarian Orthodox, the Serbian Orthodox. You also have small pockets of Catholic communities. And then there are diverse Jewish communities as well. And so the Ottomans, the way that they managed their diversity was through elevating kind of local community leaders, and these different communities would sort of negotiate often as a community, as opposed to kind of an individual vis-a-vis the state.
Outside of the Ottoman Empire, were there any Muslims in the rest of Europe
Yes.
at the time?
Yes, there were. There were significant Muslim communities in the Russian Empire. By 1900, there's about 14 million. There are also Muslim communities in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 18th century, which then gets partitioned between Russia, the Habsburg Empire, and Prussia. Those Muslim communities are both in the Russian area and also in part of the Habsburg area. Crimea, which becomes part of the Russian Empire, had a Muslim majority. So they're often what we consider like the European peripheries. And these are historic communities that had developed either through the Ottoman Empire or also through the Mongol expansion. When empires retracted, often communities would remain.
So things start with the Congress of Berlin in 1878.
Mm-hmm.
What was the context for that Congress? What had gone on to lead to that Congress?
Yeah, so there's a major war in the 1870s, and the Congress of Berlin is essentially, a European brokered peace treaty. And there were representatives from many different countries that went there. And this was the legal treaty and arrangement that would allow for a country like Serbia and Romania to become independent, because to be an independent country, you had to be both have a country that you're putting forward, but also recognition, right? And the international recognition is often the last part of it, as we continue to see in states around the world today. And so this was a moment where those states were sort of legitimized as in the international system. And it was also the moment where they decided that Austria-Hungary could legally occupy Bosnia-Herzegovina and take control of that Ottoman province. And a number of things happen in that Congress that are, I think, really important to understanding how sort of European political thinkers were understanding Muslims. Prior to that moment, when states sort of would conquer Muslim lands, the presumption was that Muslims would leave and that they would, the word is often used, return, although what does that mean when they've lived in the same place their whole lives, right? They would return to the Ottoman Empire, and that their properties and would remain in the new states. One of the things that changes in 1878, and which is largely why I started my book there and which is so fascinating to me, is that in the countries that become independent, they are required to give those Muslims who stay full citizenship rights. And this is really one of the first times where we see in European history this delineated, that Muslims are entitled to equal citizenship to other Christian communities in these lands. And that's a big kind of legal shift that happens. Now, it's certainly not a feel-good story, right? A lot of these Muslim communities continue to experience repression and discrimination, and it's really complicated and difficult. And many of them don't want to live in these new states where they're suddenly given citizenship. But from a general level, thinking about the project of Europe and the project of European citizenship, it's a big change. And I will point out that in certain areas in the French Empire, a Muslim could not have citizenship rights until 1946. unless they renounced Islam. The British Empire is really dealing with their Nationality Act in 1948 to try to make sense of these things. So this is happening at an earlier moment, and it's integrating kind of new legal languages, and it's both imposed on these countries and also then something that becomes negotiated with the members of the Muslim elite who remain.
Where did this idea of nation states come from? And how did that work?
So the idea of the nation state, again, is sort of part of this modern Europe project, which is that people belong to a nation, which can be defined along kind of cultural, linguistic, historical terms, and that those nations should be sort of governing themselves and have political sort of rights. And it is a direct challenge to the idea of empire, which is a different form of political governance that brings together, lots of different people. So it emerges, after the French Revolution. There's lots of national kind of movements and ideologies in Germany, in Italy, in Greece, that are sort of playing with ideas of what does this look like, right? What does it mean to have a state for a nation? At every step of the way, the sort of formation of these nation states leaves people out because none of these territories were homogenous. And there are many people who didn't sort of identify or feel part of any nation in the 19th century. And so we end up with kind of this system of statehood that becomes ever more codified in the 20th century, especially after World War I, that is designed in a way that it can't tolerate or handle Europe's heterogeneous populations.
So these Muslim communities that were under the Ottoman Empire were really varied, right? They spoke Turkish, Albanian, Tatar, Romani, Slavic languages. They could write, those who could write wrote in different languages, Arabic, Persian, Ottoman, Turkish. Some were urban, some were rural, some were fighters. There was a vast variety of religious practices. Some were Sufis. And like any individual, Muslims shifted between groups, right? There's not one standard Muslim. Muslims are completely varied and they changed their identities. They spoke multiple languages. So why were Muslims defined in terms of their religion rather than as people of the land?
So this emerges through both the Congress of Berlin and also sort of through negotiations that happen in various places after regions stop being part of the Ottoman Empire. There are a number of treaties that get formed that sort of argue that on both sides, right? The Ottomans promised to provide certain kinds of rights and privileges to Christian communities that remain in the Ottoman Empire, and these Christian majority states, which they are, promised to give Muslim communities religious rights, religious freedom. And so it's defined at the level of sort of treaty, and then it trickles down. Now, within the Ottoman Empire, because individuals identified and understood themselves as part of different religious groups, this is also how many Muslim communities understood the sort of as a path to protect themselves. That because sort of if you could frame certain rights as fitting within the larger rubric of your rights as a Muslim, for example, to not have proselytization in your schools, right? To not have derogatory depictions of the Prophet Muhammad in your school textbooks. If you could frame these things as part of your sort of rights as a Muslim minority, you could have sort of power within the system to try to exact change. And also sort of protect the way that then Muslim societies and cultures were represented and depicted in new states. So it was both coming from a sort of Muslims became increasingly understood as the Muslim, right? Both from the level of international law and then also from sort of the ground up, where it became a way to make sure that the communities, broadly were protected. And it was easier to negotiate with a single voice, right? It's if you have 15 different Muslims show up at a courthouse asking for 15 different sets of rights in different languages, that's much more difficult to negotiate, especially in a hostile political situation, than sort of a single or two representatives who go and say, on behalf of our community, this is what we would like to request. So the system sort of sets up this pressure to flatten Muslim heterogeneity and sort of forces Muslims to become ever more sort of homogenous. And this creates, and we can talk more about it, it creates all sorts of rifts and tensions within Muslim communities. Who gets to decide? Who gets to be the voice? Is it, a Slavic voice? Is it an Albanian voice? Is it a Turkish voice? But also, what a religious, is there going to be one religious practice in an area that has a long history of really dynamic and diverse cultural and religious and social practices?
So what do Muslim communities do? I feel like we're still in 1878. Okay. It was a big year. So when they discover they're not going to be part of this Muslim empire anymore, but they're going to be part of new states, they've got three options. Is that right? They can reject these borders and revolt. They can emigrate to the Ottoman Empire, or they can say, okay, we will take citizenship and be a religious minority. What do the majority do? Do the people who can, do they leave? Or is it not that straightforward?
So it's really complicated, right? So if we think about the ones who revolt, so there's large-scale rebellions, and they don't just happen in 1878. There's also rebellions later in the 19th century and into the 20th century. I mean, even in 1923 and 24, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, we still have sort of revolts and rebellions of people saying, this is not the state I want to live in. We are the people, who are from this region, and we want to define our political future. One of the challenges that those who revolt face, if you refuse to accept that this state should exist and you should be part of it, then you can't claim rights in it, because the states are seen as the legitimate actors, even though 2 years earlier, those states did not exist. And that's really infuriating for people. So we have that category. The category of people who stay in terms of whether they want to leave. Some do. We have a lot of examples, especially from 1912, 1913, of very poor Muslim communities who would prefer to leave and have very limited resources to do so. You end up with widespread refugee camps, especially in what is today sort of North Macedonia, a lot of violence where people will sort of try to leave. There's not easy routes to go. And they encounter sort of what we would today call paramilitary groups along the way. This is obviously really also deeply traumatizing to women traveling alone with children and elderly family members and trying to find safety. And then there's others who decide they're going to stay. And those decisions, some are because there is nowhere to go or there's no money to go with. And others are saying, no, you can't. We're going to build whatever's next. We're going to stay in our homes. We're going to do what we can to protect our property, our family homes, our burial grounds become really important, right? Where our ancestors are. These are our lands, and we're going to figure out a way to try to make this work.
Yeah. Now, this is, if we can have some examples now, what is exactly the premise of your book, which is how these communities did have agency. So if we're talking now in the period sort of from that 1878 until, I suppose, the Balkan Wars, so the 1912 and then World War I. So for, that period, what, how did Muslims negotiate this new these new nation states, and how did they have agency? And I think you've broken it down in 4 sections. So maybe if you just want to pick a couple and give examples or go through each one. I know one of them was Muslim rights and political belonging, so representation. And then another one was confessional sovereignty, so the right to be Muslim. And then a third was modernization, so an assimilation. So I think that you could give some examples about education. And then the fourth one was property rights. So however you think is best to exemplify how they did have agency in those
areas.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So we see this in a number of different ways. So, for example, we'll start with some political rights and representation. In most of the Balkan countries, including Austria-Hungary, Muslims have the right to be represented as Muslim. And so there are sort of political representatives in the equivalent of local parliaments. There's also local government representatives that in certain kinds of towns and villages where there are significant Muslim populations. And that representation can take a number of different forms, and it actually can kind of blend in with some of the other categories that you listed. For example, there's a mufti in Montenegro who is helping to negotiate sort of how the state can access and use certain kinds of property that had belonged to the Waqf. And, so you get these kind of negotiations even at the ground level. Right?
Tell us what the Waqf is.
Oh, so the Waqf are the Islamic pious endowments that were set up within the Ottoman Empire and then remain after the Ottomans are gone in these other territories and these other states. And so they would invest money sort of generation after generation, and they would build schools, they would build hospitals, they would build roads, and they became really active in the public sphere. So when these new sort of centralizing states are conquering or absorbing diverse Muslim lands, these waqfs continue to exist there and often own major public works that they need access to. And so in this example of this mufti in Montenegro, he has a negotiation over the aqueduct. How does it work? Who gets to use it? Right? How do you streamline infrastructure? And so this is one of these kinds of examples where it might not be a big picture idea, but it's a very practical way that local states are negotiating the transition out of the Ottoman Empire with prominent Muslim communities that live and own lands and and manage pious endowments in these territories. Other places where we see actively trying to negotiate for rights are in the realm of law. So Muslims who are arguing for certain kinds of interpretations of law that align more with the ways that law had been before under the Ottomans. And then as well as in education. So we have different kinds of Muslim community leaders, but also teachers and newspapers, right, who are reading through textbooks and saying, why is certain kind of history depicted in this way? How do we change those historical narratives so that they treat Muslim communities with respect? These are people who live here. If you depict, the Ottoman Empire exclusively as foreign and other, and you understand Muslims as being descendants of the Ottomans, are you then depicting Muslims as foreign and other? And so they fight against it.
Then we have the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, followed by World War I.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of wars, lots of violence. So here there was violence, famine, disease. One main outcome from these wars is the creation of Yugoslavia, which was a newly constituted state called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And that was founded in 1918. And so is this where most Balkan Muslims end up, in this Yugoslavia? And if that is the case, why and how?
So the state of Yugoslavia does become sort of this largest state in the middle of the Balkans that's absorbing all of these different territories that had been part of the Ottoman Empire, but that had different trajectories. So part of Yugoslavia is the state of Serbia, which had expanded during the Balkan Wars to annex what is today Kosovo and North Macedonia, which had really large Muslim populations. Also, Montenegro becomes part of the state of Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia. The other country that has a really significant Muslim population at this time in the Balkans is Bulgaria. Oh, and Albania, of course.
Muslim communities are still considered as a single group. And this is now enshrined in something called the minority clause.
Yes, so that's actually really complicated. They're not necessarily a singular group in the minority clause. It's this complex gray area where Muslims are defined both by language and by religion, whereas most minorities in Europe have a singular understanding of what the minority is. You have a Hungarian minority or an Italian minority or the Jewish minority. Muslims are simultaneously being treated in international law and in domestic law as well after 1918 as both members of linguistic communities, so the Turkish minority, the Albanian minority, and members of a religious community, Muslims.
Yeah, I just want to describe this lack of grounds for cultural or linguistic unity. There was lots of Islamic legal cultures, for example. People had differing views on polygamy. It was practiced in parts of Macedonia, for example. On clothing, some women wore the niqab, whereas in places like Zagreb, you had people wearing Western dress. You had Sufis in Kosovo who included alcohol in their traditional ceremonies, whereas Bosnian scholars, saw this as a complete violation of Islamic law. So just this variety, I think, is really important to describe. And it's really fascinating because it shows that these people who are from the same geography, roughly, not huge in number, but it really shows how no two Muslims are identical. And then if we go now to what you were probably about to say, that two dominant schools of thoughts emerged. You had the reformists and you had traditionalists.
Yeah, so those are the two sort of broad categorical labels that I try to use to make sense of the distinctions that emerge. Because there's far more than two groups, right? Just like there's no two Muslims are identical. There's a lot of different groups. But I really wanted to try to think through how we can kind of categorize the main threads or trends that emerged in the 1920s and 30s. And one is to sort of lean in to more sort of the ideas of modernity. These are the reformists. Many of the debates are around, like, what does Islamic law prescribe? But they're often cultural debates, right? Should women be wearing a headscarf? Is that prescribed by Islam? Should, co-ed schools exist? Should, Muslim women go to schools with non-Muslims? One school of thought is we are part of a dynamic, diverse society, and we need to, in order to sort of protect the Muslim community, we need to train our students to be able to be leaders of Yugoslavia, right? They need to speak Serbo-Croatian. They need to be educated in a Serbian and Croatian and Bosnian context, depending on where you are. They need to understand this history, and then they can become leaders and participate fully in the political and economic life. The other school of thought among traditionalists is we need to protect our community. And to do so, we need to hold on to what we understand to be kind of more traditional norms, right? So segregated schools, a prohibition on mixed marriages, wanting to keep sort of Islamic schools vibrant and supported, protection of the Waqf. For example, one of sort of a non-cultural one, right, is about the bank. Right? Should Muslims have their own bank in this system? Is that, a violation of Islamic law? Is it actually a way to protect the community by investing and having its own assets? Right. So debates come in all different kinds of topics that we just think of as modern statehood and building schools and banks and factories and movie theaters and what this sort of all will look like. But these two main threads sort of become conflicted over how to do it.
What's interesting is that you also have now a third group emerge who are the Islamic legal revivalists. Mm-hmm. So I suppose now we're thinking about the Muslim world and what was going on in the wider Muslim world. Mm-hmm. And that kind of created these people who I suppose you can call it political Islam. Tell us about this group, these Islamic legal revivalists, mm-hmm. as well.
Yeah, so after the abolition of the caliphate and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there's a splintering of sort of Islamic kind of global Islamic legal and political and cultural authority that occurs. And in the 1920s and 30s, Cairo really emerges as another center of thinking. And for Muslims the majority of the world's Muslims were sort of either occupied or absorbed by non-Muslim states in the after World War I. And so this creates a real crisis of sort of what possibility do we have, and where, what is the world going to look like for us going forward, and how do we claim power and political authority and a voice on, an international stage? Well, that kind of idea trickles down to the local as well. Many of the leaders of sort of the Islamic legal revivalist or political Islamic movement, and these, we could talk more about the categories if we want, but these movements were actually trained in Egypt, and they come back and they're thinking, how does this look, and what do we need to do in order to protect Muslim communities in Southeastern Europe, in Yugoslavia? One of the things that I think is really important is to situate this story of these grassroots movements. They start with grassroots, they grow, they have periodicals, they have schools, one runs for office, and they develop into a really mass movement that's very popular. And one of the things that's so important to remember is that this is happening across Europe in the 1930s, right? This is, I think, a particularly European moment for mass movements, mass political movements, many of which are sort of taking positions that seek to kind of define and redefine who's going to be part of a community and what that community's relationship is going to be with the state. And much like, you have grassroots movements across, other parts of Europe, especially across Central and Eastern Europe, this is a moment of fascist expansionism in many places. There's robust communist movements in the 1920s and 30s across Europe. There's nationalist movements. There's all different kinds of movements. It's like this era of kind of political excitement. You also then have, in Yugoslavia, you also have a political Islamic movement that forms and is engaging with these debates and with the idea that the world that was created after 1918 does not necessarily need to be the world that persists.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about this backdrop. So you've got the state of the Muslim world at the time, that over the course of the 19th and the early 20th centuries, the majority of the world's Muslims were being absorbed by non-Muslim European governments. Mm-hmm. So this is, that just reading that really made me stop, and I had to reread it several times. So Muslims really had no agency. They were disempowered. So you've got the majority of Muslims being colonized. And then on top of that, you've got the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Mm-hmm. And so this is really explaining why Muslims are searching. You say that the Muslims in this study were not a product of the systems of European colonialism that shaped Muslim lives around the world. Was the Balkans and also the Soviet Union the only place that Muslims were not colonized?
Well, some would argue that both of those situations are, colonial systems of repression. But in both of those countries, the Balkans had multiple countries, they were places where Muslims had equal rights to other citizens. Right? And Albania is a great example of this as well, because that was a Muslim majority country that had sort of national rights for all Albanian speakers, regardless of religion.
Okay, and then you have the final section, which is the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And there's no single Balkan Muslim experience of the Second World War. Some embraced political Islam, some fascism, some communism, and these were all ways to reject the European political order created after World War I. So can you tell us a little bit about this response to these wartime dynamics?
Yeah, so I really like to think of the events in World War II as coming out of World War I. That the World War I redraws, the map of Europe, the political map of Europe. And there are winners and there are losers. And a lot of Muslims in Europe are losers of this system. They are not given a voice at the table. They are not asked what where they want to be. And so, the majority of Southeast European Muslims are deeply unhappy with the interwar system. They recognize and understand that the current world does not create space for them to have, agency. And so what kind of political movement might? And so some do see, especially Hitler's Europe, it's a successful imperial structure that's looking for local allies. And they're looking for local allies everywhere. And they're among the few that are willing to say to Muslims, we're going to give you political power. So there are, and this exists in places like Crimea, but also in, Kosovo and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, there are different elite Muslim groups that say, this is going to be the best path forward. There are others who look towards internationalism and communism, right? And think, well, maybe there's some sort of structure through a communist system which erases these kinds of political boundaries and these national boundaries and actually could elevate the minorities to an equal status. And then there's others who argue, we should have some kind of restoration of an Ottoman area, or even looking to Turkey to invade or come back, like wanting to kind of not move to Turkey, but have sort of an expansion of Turkey into where they live. And it's complex and it's again violent, and there's Muslims fighting in lots of different armies against other Muslims. And just as there are Germans fighting in different armies and Poles fighting in different armies, this is a very European story.
After World War II, communism won in this area. Mm-hmm. What was the Muslim response here?
So when the war first ends, there's a collective sigh of relief, right? The war is over. Initially, the communists promise Muslim leaders that they are not going to attack Islam, and that they are not going to arrest Islam, religious leaders or take apart. They're not going to sort of launch a radical atheistic campaign. And they're also not going to take all their property. And so that kind of creates a sort of a temporary period of like a pause, right? Now, they don't do any of those things. The communist state, once it fully consolidates power, it immediately, shutters all of the Sharia courts, starts closing down maktabs and madrasas throughout the region, arresting religious leaders, executing many of the leaders of sort of political Islamic groups. And that goes on for several years. And so once again, Muslims have some choices, and one of them is to fight, and they do. There's small militias that are formed throughout the Balkans, or the territories that will eventually kind of be consolidated around socialist Yugoslavia. They create small armies. They try to fight. Again, they try to connect with Turkey and with the U.S. and become part of an anti-communist front that includes lots of different people. Others start to negotiate, and others leave. Right. So you have these kind of three cycles of choices that we've seen, again and again, starting in 1878 and then again in 1912 and 13 and 1918. And once again, there's this sense of we have three options.
Okay, let's think about some conclusions that we can draw from this. So I have to say I found the book really thoughtful and really empathetic. So that empathy really comes through. And then you make us think about some really big themes. And one of them is secularism. So this idea that, Muslims don't fit into a secular society, it's actually a function of how you define secularism. So can you talk us through that, and how, I think one of our guests from a previous podcast described secularism as a watered down version of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And then that same thing comes out really in your book. So can you explain that for us?
Yeah, I think that's a great framing of it, a watered down version of Christianity, because secularism, I think, becomes a kind of ideology that seeks to impose a single norm on all, heterogeneous populations of sort of Europe. And it does so with a very singular idea of what a secular Europe will or should look like. And what I try to kind of engage with in the book is how that's, there's deep contradictions embedded in the idea of secularism. And also, some of it just does not make logical sense, right? And what we see at different points is Muslim communities making that argument, right? Well, why can't we close shop on Fridays? Right? Why did shops have to be closed on Sundays? Or during Ramadan, Muslims would go to bat and say, this is our religious holiday. We're, happy to work on Easter, right? We need to have certain kinds of, infrastructure built in. And so one of the things I sort of raise is, how did we get to, a Europe where it's fine to drink alcohol, in some places, and it's understood as, or not drinking alcohol is seen somehow as not European, right? There's certain kinds of presumptions that come and draw out of practices of Islam that are sort of classified as kind of anti-secular, but it's very arbitrary.
Right. So basically, Europeans only had one version of secularism. Mm-hmm. You also talk about a hierarchy of citizenship. Mm-hmm. What are you referring to there?
So even in places that claim to have equal citizenship, by the written law, there are distinct practices where not all citizenship is treated equally. And we see that throughout Southeastern Europe, this constant tension at different places where the rights of certain groups are not equivalent to others. And sometimes that's in, for example, in the Balkan Wars, in the Serbian army, Muslim troops were often stationed separately, right? And there might be arguments for why that is. Oh, well, we wanted to have a single cook so that they could eat halal food, right? But there's underlying questions of, loyalty and ability to sort of elevate, or go through the army. Likewise, in terms of, the ways that people get employment, state rights, veteran benefits, these kinds of things, Muslims were constantly realizing they were not being treated on equal playing ground as other citizens.
So what are you kind of calling for then, do you think? Do you think it's a new way to think about citizenship for a truly secular Europe?
So I think what I'm trying to do ultimately with the book is to take seriously, that Muslim histories in Europe are Europe's histories, that we have to rethink some of our grand narratives in ways and understand that they've been written from the perspectives of certain states, certain political actors, certain majority populations, and they've been written in a way that erases not just people, but diverse storylines.
Muslim Footprints is developed and produced by Kelima Communications in partnership with the Ismaili, the online platform for the global Ismaili community. This episode was filmed in Nashville, Tennessee by Amir Hakim, Malik Nota, and Ibrahim Ismail. And here's the team at the Ismaili who helped put it together. Amira Jiwani is the series producer. Azim Lakhani is the editor, with assistance from Suraya Mirali for subtitling. Rasul Daya and Alim Karmali have reviewed content and helped with promotion on the Ismaili website. Aziza Jan Mahmoud is our social media strategist who is managing the Muslim Footprints social media accounts. And Alia Muhammad is supporting with promoting the series. Shahid Karim, who oversees the team at the Ismaili, is executive producer for the show, along with me. We're grateful to our external reviewers, who are all members of the board of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. These include Shainul Jiwa, Associate Professor and a Specialist in Fatimid Studies, Orkan Mir Kasimov, Associate Professor and a Specialist in Islamic History, Dr. Hakim El-Nazarov, Head of the Central Asian Studies Unit, Dr. Dagikudo Dagiev, Senior Research Associate and a Specialist in Central Asian Studies, and William Rees Hoffman, Research Associate in the South Asian Studies Unit and an ethnomusicologist. Additional reviews were also provided by Shiraz Alibai, Deputy Director at the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And thank you all for watching. Be sure to follow our social media pages where you can find additional content and keep up to date with our news. My name is Aisha Daya and you've been watching Muslim Footprints.